Good morning, and welcome everyone to the latest Harnham Live. We are here today for a contract special. It's a UK contract special where we're going to talk all things IR35, reflect back on what we saw this time last year, and then look ahead to the future as well. I'm very pleased to be joined by Andy from Kingsbridge, who can provide some know-how and some insights into all things IR35. So, Andy, do you want to say hi to everyone?
Yeah, morning, Dan, and hello everybody who's listening. As Dan said, I work for Kingsbridge, business development manager here, and have worked in the sort of staffing and recruitment world for about 6 years now, insuring contractors for their professional indemnity and public liability insurance. I'll just give a bit of an intro for Kingsbridge as well. So we set up in 2001 and we provide contractor insurance, professional indemnity and public liability to about 55,000 contractors now. And more recently, over the last couple of years, provide IR35 consultancy services to recruitment agencies, accountancies, and end clients as well.
Cool, lovely stuff. And for those of you who don't know me, I manage Harnham's UK and European contract practice. If you are, obviously this is all to do with the UK market because it's about IR35, but if you are interested in the European markets, feel free to reach out and chat separately. Always happy to speak to you. But Andy, for those of us who aren't familiar with IR35, it's if you're interested in the contract market, it's going to be, I don't know where you've been if you haven't heard of it yet, but it's been well talked about. But could you give kind of a general overview for those who might not be too familiar with it?
Yeah, sure. So IR35 is a piece of tax legislation. It's actually been around for years now, over 20 years. And it's a piece of legislation which distinguishes between those who are legitimately trading and working through a limited company and paying tax in that way, and distinguishing those who are working through a limited company but sort of look and feel like an employee. And it's a piece of legislation which basically highlights those that are avoiding tax.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. So we've got it's a slightly interesting period actually, because the legislation was due to, the changes in the legislation were due to go live earlier this year in April. However, obviously due to the global pandemic, things have changed and it's been pushed back by 12 months, and it looks like it is happening, but we have a funny kind of looking glass into what life could have been, because we kind of have gone through this once already. So you know, one of the purposes of this conversation and things we want to cover is actually what do we see, what have we learned, and then maybe how can we better prepare ourselves for the changes, because it will impact people from what we saw. So last time around, you know, from our perspective, it definitely started to come into effect. I think one of the key things that we look at when we consider the legislation, how it impacts us from a recruitment standpoint, it's about contractors getting new roles, how the recruitment process works, and how easy it is to extend people's contracts, and certainly we saw some challenges that came from a number of places. Really, it came from you know, contractors wanting to retain their income if they were going to be taxed more, companies being worried about exposing themselves to risk by making mistakes or by HMRC investigating them, and also by just general complications from an admin perspective, and people not really knowing, or maybe leaving it too late to be prepared. And I think, you know, Andy and I have been speaking about this topic for a long time, and Kingsbridge have advised us in a number of places. And the general advice that you were giving well over a year ago was to start preparing, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, preparation from all parties in the recruitment supply chain Just it needs to happen now, really. And like we said, done before. Leading up to April 2020, there was mixed sort of signals out there in the market. Some had prepared better than others, and the delay was a bit of a blessing. But even before that, looking at the public sector changes back in 2017, there was learnings there that preparations were massively important to everybody involved.
Mm. So for those who aren't familiar with that, basically the changes that are coming up affect the private sector, but these equivalent changes have been made to the public sector a few years ago. So there's some really interesting use cases that we're going to touch on later from what happened back then. And actually, the contracting market is fairly strong now in a lot of places in the public sector. So they've clearly overcome the challenges that you get with the IR35 legislation change. I think one of the most talked about things that we began to see, and it affected probably more larger organizations, but was the blanket determinations. So basically companies have an obligation to assess every single role, assess the conditions, and do they think it's inside or outside of IR35 before they advertise it. Or before they extend a contract, and a lot of companies took the position on a essentially a blanket ban of PSCs or limited company contractors or whatever you want to call it. What are your thoughts on that, Andy?
In terms of blanket banning,
yeah.
Well, it's what we saw quite a few sort of large banks do, and it's a way of. I suppose it can be seen as the easiest option, really, and the least risk. It's probably not the way forward. It's definitely not the way forward, as you'd lose a lot of talent that way. You'll start to see contractors start engaging with those end clients that have a real stringent process in place, that know their contractor book, they know their contracts, and actually just carrying out these blanket bans, we'll probably see lack of talent and moving of talent to their rivals, really, and their competitors.
Yeah, which obviously means a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of skills, a transfer of kind of market share as well. But I think what's particularly perhaps interesting is the wrong word, but it certainly does throw a spanner in the works, is the fact that the world is a very different place this time around, and actually contingent workers, flexible workers remaining lean and relying on contractors to deliver projects is probably more important than it was 12 months ago. So actually, losing access to a contingent workforce or a talent pool could be actually quite high risk at the moment, because there's simply not going to be the investment to bring someone in as a permanent member of staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw it happen back in the public sector, and again, I'm sure we probably will see it in some cases come April 2021 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another from a recruitment standpoint, another thing that it didn't. So aside from the big companies who were kind of putting their own processes in place, we also found it quite challenging with smaller businesses. Perhaps who they're 100 or so people or less. They again, especially small consultancies, will rely on contractors to kind of fill roles for their clients and to deliver projects that they may not have permanent resource for. Mm-hmm. But they want to continue their kind of growth and say yes to working with various businesses. It was just generally, what do they need to do? That's quite difficult, because the first part of the process is down to the end client to assess the working conditions, and that's part of the legislation. And actually getting everyone talking, getting everyone communicating. And even we had the question a number of times: how do we do this? And actually, that fundamentally that does provide a challenge. And that's certainly something which we've worked quite hard into looking into overcoming in future. And actually, it ties quite in with so I will remind everyone, please do feel free to add comments and ask questions. We'll try and get to them as much as we can. And we've had a question through from Stephen. From Richard here, who is asking about online tools which enable the comparison of inside, outside, and things like that. With regards to status determinations, absolutely, that's something that's been developed, and we now have a tool which we are going to use to basically help with that initial stage of the process. I think one thing that is clear is that companies are going to have to rely on third parties and partnerships a little bit more, especially once they get used to the legislation, and actually knowing how to just kickstart and speed things up when it comes to hiring contractors is going to be really important. So yeah, if you want to know more about this tool afterwards, then again, ping me. But essentially, it means that we can take the initial status determination process on. And kind of provides evidence that companies have done their due care and they've thought about it. And what's really interesting is obviously it's all down to the working conditions, and those aren't set in stone. They're not fixed throughout the duration of a contract. So certain tweaks and changes can be made, which will hopefully improve people's working conditions with regards to their status determination. Andy, I want to ask you then about what we saw in the public sector, because I think that's really quite important to consider. We had 12 months ago, but also what happened 2-3 years ago as well. Do you have any kind of examples of a company who maybe didn't get it right the first time round?
I think there's probably quite a few. It happened a lot quicker in comparison to now. Businesses had a lot less time to prepare, especially given the delay that we've had for the last year or that we're in now. What happened in the public sector was there was no real understanding of the legislation, really. And if you take NHS, for example, or TfL, blanket bans were given on their workers. I mean, NHS locum doctors were sort of at the forefront of it, and at that point the assessments weren't fair, blanket bans and just no acceptance of PSCs or limited companies whatsoever. And it got to a point where actually those doctors looked to walk off site, and again it's something that we don't want to happen again this time round, where those contractors do that. What they saw was a lack of talent just about to leave their workforce. And then realize that actually there is a solution. And like you said, Dan, just partnering with those that understand the legislation, they have a solution in place, is absolutely vital leading up to April and beyond. Yeah.
And I can understand why people would take a low risk option, which is essentially the blanket ban is the lowest risk option, because it's those who are outside of IR35 who get investigated. But that's looking at the risk from a, I guess, what could you potentially be fined, or what are HMRC going to come after you for? But actually that doesn't then factor in the business risk of projects not being delivered, and loss of talent, which you may not be able to get back again if they go off and they have a better experience from someone else, and have more trust in someone else who does have a robust process in place. So with the processes that you're looking at, or that you're referring to here from the public sector, generally speaking, what have you seen? I guess there's probably no clear-cut example of what best practice should look like, but what are the general things that you've seen from people who seem to hire well, despite this change in legislation?
Well, initially understanding your current workforce is absolutely vital. So knowing who your contractors are, who are on your contract book, and then engaging with a third party like Kingsbridge to assess those contracts, those actual contracts. Once you then engage Kingsbridge, such as leading up to April 2021, we're able to look at the actual working practices, breaking it down into the key status tests, at which point I won't go into those now. We haven't got time. But looking at the sort of working environment of those contractors, assessing those actual contracts and contractors, and then being able to start engaging them either inside or outside of IR35. Worth mentioning as well, there is insurance out there, especially through Kingsbridge, that would limit the risk, basically. You are given an outside determination. You can insure that determination with the peace of mind that if HMRC were to investigate any tax fines and penalties that they deem, would be fully insured.
So ultimately, that's obviously looking at the business themselves, the company who are hiring. But that, you know, for a lot of contractors, certainly last time around, they might have felt actually a lot of decisions were made that ultimately impact them. It impacts their pocket, their take home. It doesn't impact the businesses who are hiring. They spend the same amount of money, you know, because a lot of them didn't up the rates despite everything. And actually, you know, they might be left feeling a little bit helpless in this sort of situation, which really shouldn't be the case if a company is hiring properly. So the idea of the legislation is to have a fair assessment of every single role, and it's not just the role, but it's actually the particular contract. So if, for example, you're a contractor now, and in March next year, you know, you're interested in a role, it turns out it's IR35, within IR35, you ask for a rate increase to compensate for the loss of earnings, and it doesn't quite, you know, match up to where you are. Really, at the moment, then the choice that you might feel like you're faced with is, I either have to, you know, bite the bullet and kind of take the hit, as it were, or walk away and gamble and try and find something else, which might be really annoying if it's a really cool project, if it's interesting, it'll look good on the CV, you know, whatever reason. There's tons of reasons for taking a role outside of, you know, your income. And actually, I would suggest that there probably are a few things that you can do. Ultimately speaking, everyone has to be happy and everyone has to communicate. And I think that's one thing that's really clear. Actually, if there's a conversation, it should be had on a case-by-case basis for every single assignment, essentially. So if, for example, you're looking at a 6-month contract and it's inside of IR35, because of certain factors, one, you should know what those factors are, having seen the status determination statement. That's a legal obligation for the end client to provide that. But then two, those conditions can change, which is why it's reassessed for every assignment. So you can do something like keep your first contract on the assignment short. It's a 6-month project, sign up for a month and see what happens. And then through, for example, we'll provide visibility if it's through us, and I'm sure there's other tools out there as well. But essentially, through looking at the evidence of the process as to how is it determined, what conversations can be had, and those conversations can be done whilst you're working within a role. To see, okay, fine, you've just asked me, to attend this meeting, for example, and I don't think it's essential for the project. I'm going to say no, and here's why. So I think there's and I totally understand why a contractor would feel and fairly so victimized in some cases, because some cases the communication is poor. But actually the communication, it definitely should work both ways. And if you need a change in the conditions, in your opinion, to try and align your work to be outside of IR35 and therefore improve your income, you need either yourselves or your recruitment agent or whoever you're running through to be explaining the reasons why, rather than simply, that's not acceptable. And I think that makes a really, really big difference, because a lot of companies, they might train their HR to understand the legislation, but they won't train the managers, and it's the managers who affect the working conditions as much as anything else. So it should be kind of a constant conversation as much as the project itself is how are we going to deliver that project. companies should be briefing in agencies up front and briefing in contractors up front when they're interviewing about those conditions as much as the role itself. And I think that's something that's really important, and you need to have that visibility. And Andy, I think that's definitely something that that you've seen with those that are doing well, despite, you know, in the public sector, and what you saw from those who are pushing through and hiring volumes of contractors is actually they're open to conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dan. Being flexible in their working practice and taking advice from those that sort of live and breathe the legislation and know what to suggest is key. I think just going back to your point on the contractor front, what can contractors be doing? Because yes, liability is shifting, and it's up to the end client to determine the IR35 status come April. But if you bear in mind, I think it's over 2 million contractors now in the UK working for themselves. That's a lot of people, you know, who lobby against or lobby for a particular thing. And like I said, the liability is shifting, but it's so important that contractors are very much involved in the contract and the working practice.
Definitely.
What we do is, or what we've got here is the ability for contractors just to get a working practices review to take to the recruitment agency or end client, and similar to what you were suggesting here, Dan, through the tool, is actually you can take a working practices review and suggest why you should be inside or outside of IR35, and that looks again to those key status tests. So yes, the liability is shifting, and the responsibility is shifting, but you know, 2 million contractors who can be involved in the IR35 changes is not to sort of be sniffed at.
I found as well that when there was a dispute previously, the conversation, it's heated would be the wrong word, but it feels like there's a bit of a faux pas, as if someone's trying to, you know, do something sneaky by suggesting they're outside of IR35. Whereas I think the conversations need to be open, and they need to be open from the very beginning. So you know, conversations around working practices should be as you know, crucial and integrated into the whole recruitment process as conversations around, you know, what skills are required from your candidate, and how long's the contract, and what's the rate. And you know, it should just be there and be part of the conversation. But you know, if you are a contractor out there and you know, you're saying, well, that all sounds all well and good in practice, but will it actually happen? You know, there are a lot of companies who haven't prepared sufficiently, and who are kind of probably going to be learning on the hop, which isn't ideal. And if you're struggling to find a contract that's outside of IR35, then I would relate back to that piece of advice, is that actually they may be open to a conversation, but it's going to be easier to influence the working conditions when you're in the role, and you know, keep certain conditions in your favor, so that you can leave if you need to, and you can agree not to extend, or whatever it may be. But then actually you can start to teach people about how it should look, and then, you know, if you're using an online tool, you can reassess the role as many times as you want. Basically, you know, and that's the thing about status determinations. We got asked the question by a lot of our clients: how do we determine this so that it's so that it's outside of IR35? Like, what do we need to put here? And you need to put the truth. I think that's really important. It should be just an open assessment of the conditions, but it can change. So just so that people understand what I mean by conditions, it's about, you know, how much control and freedom does the contractor have to do with, you know, how and where they deliver the work that they're done. Because, you know, as an example, you know, if someone is truly a self-employed consultant, they are in the best position themselves to dictate how a project should be delivered, because they're ultimately the ones that are kind of, you know, on the hook for delivering it. So that's obviously, it's more complex than that, and we won't go into detail now. We can do afterwards if someone wants to have a follow-up chat with us. But no, those are things that can be that can be altered, that can be changed, and I think that the key thing is it's going to be conversations, and it's going to be partnerships, and it's going to be one person speaking to another person a little bit more about things that they didn't used to talk about because it was a bit kind of hush hush. Whereas now it needs to be out in the open.
Yeah, and I think relating back to the 2017 change in the public sector, there were some fairly rocky months. End clients, staffing agencies, contractors didn't really know what was going on the whole. I don't want to put a sort of general, determination for all that, but there were a few months where people didn't really know what was going on. Following that, it did settle down. We're 3 years now past that, and you see a lot of public sector hirers recruiting limited company contractors legitimately. But it has, it's taken a few years for it to settle down. I don't think it will happen again like that. I don't think it will be as long. I think maybe as we approach April and maybe a month or so after, there'll be some sort of turbulent times. But on the whole, I think now we're September now, nearly October. We're sort of 6 months out. There's still time. There's still plenty of time to look at your processes. Everybody in the supply chain as well. That's not just end clients. That, like we were saying, contractors as well. Look at the legislation. Become familiar with it. Don't become a tax expert. There's people out there for that. But familiarize yourself with the legislation and know what's going on. I think that's probably the key pieces of advice.
There's a few, there's a few basics that I also think are a no-brainer. If you're not sure about the legislation, and you're not sure what you're doing or asking for or saying to someone is right, then in the early stages, ask for help. I know there's a lot of businesses that are trying to in-house as much of their recruitment processes as possible for obvious reasons, especially at the moment where saving money is important. But at the same time, you might rely on those contractors to dig a company out of a tricky spot. And so if you're not sure, you just engage a third party, someone who knows what they're doing, that you can trust, because that's what so many companies that suffered in the public sector ended up doing, and actually managed to carry on business as usual. Another piece that you touched on earlier, Andy, but I'd like to kind of bring back and stress is, like, again, if you're not sure, make sure that you've got insurance, so that if a mistake is made, then you are protected. For me, it's an absolute no-brainer. There's like, for example, at the moment, you probably wouldn't go on holiday without travel insurance, because it's all a bit up in the air. The same should apply to hiring a contractor. Make sure that there's insurance, and the insurance the best insurance products will cover the supply chain rather than the individual. And if you're a contractor, I mean, you've sourced your own insurance, or if I know, for example, that we actually take out insurance ourselves as a recruitment agency. And again, it's just to give everyone peace of mind, so that if a mistake, touch wood, it's not, but if a mistake is made, which there will be a few that slip through the net over the first year or two of the legislation change, at least there's cover and people aren't going to be out of pocket, and lessons can be learned from that. But yeah, I think I've mentioned it a few times already, but really communication is going to be absolutely vital, and people genuinely partnering with one another, and rather than sticking their head in the sand and avoiding the conversation about IR35 because either they don't understand it and they are worried they'll look silly, or they don't want to be too forceful and make a company think that it's all about the money, or whatever reasons. Have the conversation, because it's as important as any other factor of hiring that person, whether it's the job spec, the rate, the location. It should be talked about, and should be a common, comfortable conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, us at Kingsbridge, we think, like the norm is now for contractors to hold professional indemnity, public liability. it will become the norm to hold a tax liability insurance as well, the full legal expenses package, which, like you say, Dan, does cover the full recruitment supply chain. Not only is it peace of mind and mitigation of risk, it actually makes you look like a more attractive limited company. You're demonstrating financial risk, and when you are going for roles, if you hold an insurance which covers not just you but everybody in the supply chain, then you look far more attractive to Joe Bloggs coming into the interview after you as well. So I think that's a big piece of advice to any contractor as we approach April.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just about covers it on the topic of what we wanted to discuss about IR35 and kind of just generally Andy and I and the rest of our teams have all experienced it for the last sort of 18 months. Andy and his guys for longer with the public sector changes, but obviously, for the last 18 months. We think that it needs to be talked about now, which is why we're here talking about it now. But that's it from me. Andy, is there anything else you wanted to mention?
No, I'll just reiterate what you say, Dan. Sort of three main takeaways is familiarize yourself with the legislation, and that's everybody in the supply chain. And like you say, engage with a third party, have partnerships, such as Kingsbridge and Harnham as well. And then lastly, I can't reiterate enough is act now. Do something now. Don't be like last time round where we're scrambling towards March and we don't have a process in place. So I really would recommend sort of acting on that now.
Absolutely. If anyone has any follow-up questions afterwards, because a lot of people will want to talk about specific things or just generally want to go into more detail, please do feel free to reach out to myself or to Andy, depending on what it is you're interested in. If you're interested in learning more about our tool, it's not yet live, but it will be within the next month or two, and it will allow us to predetermine contracts and extensions. So if you're sat there in an HR team thinking, I'm not sure how I'm going to tackle this, but I know I need to do it, feel free to give me a shout and we can talk you through what we'd advise. If you want more information about insurance products or, as a contractor, how to look more attractive in terms of removing the risk from the companies looking to hire you, definitely give Andy and the guys at Kingsbridge a call because they've got some really good stuff over there as well. We've also, just as a highlight as well, a little plug towards some really cool bits of market info, not just for UK contractors, but for permies as well as people in Europe. We've just released the salary guide a few months ago, and more recently a really insightful diversity white paper on the analytics market, which is definitely worth a read if you want to see the latest trends within diversity in the analytics market specifically. It's well worth picking that up, and you can download all of that for, hopefully there's going to be some links coming up, and if not, send me a message or jump on our website and it'll all be on there as well. Cool. Well, thanks very much everyone for tuning in and listening, and we'll speak to you again soon.